There's something about Appalachian back roads that no map can capture. Not the ones printed in atlases, and not the ones on your phone screen. The roads I'm talking about don't always show up. And the things that happen on them, the things people see, the situations they find themselves in, the moments they can't explain, those don't show up anywhere either. Not in newspapers, not in police reports. Sometimes not even in conversation, because the people who lived through them stopped talking about what happened a long time ago. What you're about to hear are 9 of those stories. Different roads, different people, different reasons for being out there in the dark. But every single one of them ends the same way, with someone driving away from something they still can't fully explain, and spending the rest of their life wondering what would have happened if they'd stayed. Story 1. I've been driving long-haul routes for going on 19 years. Mountain roads, night runs, backcountry freight. Nothing out there should have been able to rattle me. But there's a stretch of gravel road in eastern Kentucky, just south of a coal town so small it doesn't have a stoplight, where I saw something parked in the middle of the road at 2:15 in the morning that I still can't make sense of. The car was running. Every door was locked, and there was nobody in it. Nobody within sight in any direction. I came around a wide bend on Route 72C, a gravel service road I used to shave 40 minutes off my Harlan County run, and my headlights hit a dark green sedan sitting dead center in the road. Not pulled to the shoulder, not stalled at an angle. Perfectly centered, like whoever parked it had lined it up deliberately. I stopped about 60 feet back and hit my air brakes. Sat there a minute watching it. The exhaust was visible in my lights, curling white in the cold air. The engine was definitely running. I radioed it in to the county dispatcher, got out of my cab, and walked up to it slowly. I checked the windows. No one inside. No bags. No coffee cup in the holder. No jacket on the seat. Just a set of keys in the ignition, and the radio turned off. I tried the door handles. All 4 locked. The fuel gauge read just above a quarter tank. I looked up and down the road. The gravel ran straight for about 200 yards in both directions before it bent into the dark tree line. No flashlight moving in the woods. No sound except the engine idling. I called out, loud enough that if someone had stepped off into the trees to relieve themselves, they would have heard me. Nothing. The dispatcher came back and told me to stay with the vehicle until a deputy could get there. I asked how long. She said 40 minutes, minimum. I pulled my rig as far to the shoulder as I could manage on that narrow road and sat there watching that car. For the first 20 minutes, nothing changed. Then, and I want to be very deliberate about this, the car moved forward about 18 inches. Not a lurch, not a roll, just a slow, deliberate creep, like someone had eased their foot off a brake. The engine was still idling. No tires spun. It moved forward, then stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and got out again. I swept the trees on both sides of the road. Nothing. I looked underneath the car, expecting maybe a wire, something. I don't know what I was looking for. The ground under it was dry gravel. No marks, except the tire impressions it had made sitting there. By the time the deputy arrived, I'd watched the car creep forward 3 more times. Always the same, slow, short, maybe a foot or 2. The deputy walked up to it, tried the doors, same result. He called for a locksmith or a Slim Jim from a tow company, which was going to be another hour. I had a delivery deadline, so I gave my statement and got back on the road. I found out later from the dispatcher, when I called to follow up the next day, that when the tow truck finally got the door open, there was no mechanical explanation for the movement. The gear selector was in park the entire time. The brake wasn't engaged, but in park, on that flat road, it shouldn't have moved at all. The registration came back to an address in Virginia, a town about 130 miles away. The owner of the vehicle was a 44-year-old man whose wife had reported him missing the previous morning. As of the time I called, he hadn't been found. I've driven that gravel road maybe 30 times since then. I always slow down at that bend. I don't know what I'm looking for. I think I'm just checking to make sure the road is empty. So far, it has been. Story 2. I've been with the West Virginia State Police for 11 years. I've worked accident scenes, domestic calls, and felony stops on switchback mountain roads in the middle of February. I am not someone who gets unsettled easily. But the night I followed an unauthorized detour sign up a mountain pass outside of Logan County, I ended up calling my sergeant at 3 in the morning just to hear another person's voice, something I had never done before in my career. It started with a routine welfare check. A motorist had called in to say there was a handwritten detour sign on Route 10 South, just past the Holden Tunnel approach, directing traffic off the highway and up a mountain access road. He said it looked hand-lettered, not a standard WVDOT sign, and it was raining, so he hadn't followed it, but he was worried other drivers might. I pulled up to the location around 1 a.m. The sign was there, a 4x4 piece of plywood nailed to a wooden stake, orange spray paint, arrows pointing up a gravel service road. Not Department of Transportation issue. Definitely not authorized. I pulled it out of the ground and was getting ready to radio it in when my headlights caught something farther up the access road. Taillights. A vehicle had gone up. I called it in and followed. The service road climbed steeply for about a mile before leveling out onto a wide gravel clearing. An old coal loading area, I figured, judging by the rusted equipment along the tree line. The vehicle I'd seen was a gray pickup, engine off, sitting in the center of the clearing. No one inside when I approached. There were fresh footprints in the mud leading away from the driver's door toward the tree line on the north side of the clearing. One set, adult male by the stride and depth. I followed them with my flashlight. They went straight into the tree line and then stopped. Not gradually, not a stumble or a turn. They stopped at the base of a large oak in open ground with no other prints around them and nothing to indicate the person had climbed the tree. I stood there for a moment, and I'm going to be honest about this. Something in the way those tracks ended made the back of my neck go cold. Not because they vanished. There could have been a dozen explanations for that. What bothered me was that I could now hear voices coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Not shouting, not distressed, just talking. Low and even, like a conversation at a kitchen table. I called for backup and identified myself loudly. The voices stopped immediately. I waited by the edge of the tree line and never heard them again. My backup arrived 20 minutes later. We searched the wood line for 300 yards in each direction and found nothing. No people, no camp, no indication of recent occupation. The gray pickup was registered to a man in Mingo County who, when we contacted him the next morning, said he had no idea his truck had been in Logan County. He lived alone and said the truck had been in his driveway when he went to sleep. He wasn't reported missing. He wasn't a person of interest in anything. There was no sign of forced entry on the vehicle. The WVDOT confirmed what I already knew. No roadwork had been planned or scheduled on Route 10 South that week or that month. Nobody had placed that sign. I've driven past that access road dozens of times since then. The plywood stake is still there. Just the stake now, because I pulled the sign. But every time I pass it, I think about those footprints
stopping in the mud for no reason, and the voices that cut off the moment I announced myself. Whatever was happening up in that clearing, someone went to the trouble of making sure people would find it. I've never figured out why.
Story 3. My job takes me to places most people never see. Foreclosures, condemned properties, land parcels that haven't been touched since the 1970s. I've walked through houses that hadn't seen a living person in 30 years. I've documented properties in communities so hollowed out by the coal bust that the post office stopped delivering decades ago. I thought I was completely immune to the atmosphere of abandoned places. I thought wrong. The job was straightforward on paper. Assess a parcel of 12 residential properties in a former coal camp community in McDowell County that a land management company had acquired for potential resale. I drove in on a county road that Google Maps still labeled as a through route, even though the pavement ended about a mile before the community and became a packed gravel lane. I arrived around 4 in the afternoon, which gave me maybe 2 hours of good light. The community had about 20 structures, rows of identical company-built houses, most of them collapsed or caved in. Windows gone, roofs dropped, porches folded into themselves. The kind of place that had been empty so long, it felt like the silence was load-bearing. I started at the north end and worked south, photographing and noting the state of each structure on my clipboard. I was on my 7th property when I noticed the light. At the far south end of the row, the last house before the road bent into the woods and disappeared, a window was lit. Not bright, not a bare bulb. Warm light, amber, like a lamp with a shade. I stood there in the cold evening, looking at it for a full minute before I accepted what I was seeing. In a community that had no power service, I had confirmed this with the utility company before coming out. One house had a lit window. My first thought was a squatter. My second thought was that I needed to be careful. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and told them what I was seeing. The deputy I reached said she'd send someone out, but it would be at least an hour and a half. I told her I'd wait at my vehicle. I did wait, for about 10 minutes. Then the light moved. It went from the front window to what I assumed was a back room. I could see it glowing from a side window crack. Someone was walking around in there with a lantern or a battery lamp. I don't know why I walked toward it. Professional instinct, maybe. Stupidity is probably closer. I went up to the front porch, which was surprisingly solid underfoot, and knocked on the door. The light stopped moving. Silence. I knocked again and identified myself, said I was a property inspector working for the land company. Silence. Then the light went out completely. I stepped back off the porch and waited. The house stayed dark. I walked around the side to look for another exit, and that's when I found the back door standing open. Not broken open, just open, unlocked on its hinges. I looked inside with my flashlight. The room was a kitchen, and on the table was a camp lantern, still warm to the touch. Next to it, a folded road map, recent addition, not old, and a half-eaten sleeve of crackers. Whoever was in that house had left through that back door in the 60 seconds it took me to walk around the building. I swept my flashlight across the backyard and into the woods beyond. I could hear footsteps in the leaves, moving fast, moving away. The deputy arrived 90 minutes later, as promised. We found the camp lantern and the map, which she photographed and logged. The map had a route marked in pencil, a series of back roads through 3 counties, with no start point and no destination marked. Just a winding line through some of the most isolated terrain in southern West Virginia. Nobody was ever found. The lantern was a common brand. The crackers were bought at any grocery store. The map had no prints on it that produced a match. I filed my report and billed the 12 properties. I still think about that warm lantern. Someone had been living, or passing through, in a place that didn't exist on any current record, and they didn't want to be found. Story 4. I carry rural mail on a route in Page County, Virginia, that covers about 63 miles of backroad, farm lane, and hollow road on any given day. I know every name on every mailbox. I know which dogs will chase my vehicle and which ones are all bark. I know the seasonal rhythms of that road better than I know my own neighborhood. When something is wrong, I feel it before I can explain it. That's what happened the Thursday in October, when the same man showed up at 4 separate stops along my route. He was standing at the end of a gravel driveway on narrow back road when I first noticed him. Older man. I'd put him in his late 60s, wearing dark work pants and a canvas jacket, no hat despite the cold. He wasn't standing near a mailbox. He was just standing at the road's edge, looking north. I thought maybe he was waiting for a ride or checking on something in the field. I didn't stop. I dropped the mail in the box and moved on. 20 minutes later, and about 7 miles down the route, he was standing on the shoulder of Elk Run Road. Same posture, facing north, perfectly still. I slowed down. I told myself it wasn't the same man, but it was. Same jacket, same pants, same build. I pulled to a stop and called out to ask if he needed help. He turned his head toward me, looked at my vehicle for a few seconds, then turned back north without responding. I drove on. I called the county office and described the situation. They said to keep my eyes open and note any concerning behavior. I said I was already doing that. He was on Route 612 when I reached it, this time on the opposite shoulder, same facing direction. 3 different roads, all heading north, all separated by significant distances. My route doesn't loop. I don't backtrack. The only way he could have gotten ahead of me was to know the route in advance, cut across on unmarked paths, or, and this is what kept running through my head, have someone driving him. But I'd seen no vehicle. By the 4th stop, I was sitting at the end of a long farm lane when I spotted him in my side mirror. He was walking up the lane behind my vehicle, unhurried, hands at his sides. I locked my doors. I called 911 this time, not the county office. I told them I had a man on foot who had appeared at multiple points along my route and was now approaching my vehicle. They asked if I felt threatened. I said I didn't know. They said they'd send a deputy. He walked up to the passenger side window and stood there looking at me through the glass. I didn't roll it down. He didn't knock or gesture. He just looked at me for a long moment. Not angry, not distressed. Patient. Like he was waiting for something. Then he turned and walked back down the lane into the tree line. The deputy arrived 18 minutes later. No sign of the man anywhere along the lane or in the adjacent fields. She took a description and ran it through the system. Nothing matching came back. Nobody in the county reported a missing person fitting that description. No property owners along my route recognized the description. No one had seen him before, as far as I could tell. I've thought a lot about those 4 stops. About the fact that he always faced north. About the fact that he never spoke. About the patience of someone who walked miles across backcountry terrain just to stand and look at a mail truck. I still run that route. I still look at every driveway. I haven't seen him again. But some Thursdays in October, when the light is low and the fields are quiet, I find myself checking my mirrors more than usual. Just in case. Story 5. I run my own tow operation out of a small lot in Yancey County, North Carolina. Have for about 14 years. I've pulled vehicles off mountain roads, out of creek beds, and off logging routes that most operators won't touch. I've handled the aftermath of some bad accidents and a few deaths. I say that not to be dramatic, but to establish that I am not a man who startles. What I found off Forest Service Road 278 on a Tuesday in November was the one call in 14 years that I am still not able to put in a simple category. Dispatch sent me out just after 9 in the morning to a reported abandoned vehicle on an FS road about 11 miles outside of Burnsville. The caller was a hunter who'd driven the access road at dawn and found a white compact car parked halfway off the road with the driver's door standing open. No emergency lights, no note. He'd waited an hour and nobody had come back for it, so he called it in. I got there around 9:40. The car was a white Hyundai, about 8 years old, angled into the grass with the driver's door open like the hunter had described. I walked up and checked the interior. Keys still in the ignition. Phone in the center console. Cracked screen, battery dead. A Wendy's bag on the floor. And when I reached in to check if the engine had cooled, it was warm. Not warm like it had been sitting for a few hours and retained heat. Warm like it had been running within the last 20 minutes. The hunter said he'd found it at first light, which was around 6:30. That was over 3 hours prior. An engine that had been off for 3 hours in 40-degree November air would be cold. This engine was not cold. I called it in immediately, told the responding deputy exactly what I'd found. While I waited, I walked the road in both directions, looking for any sign of which way the driver had gone. I found a single muddy boot print on the road's edge, pointing into the woods, and then nothing. The forest floor was thick with leaves, and I couldn't track it further. The deputy ran the plates and reached the registered owner, a 29-year-old woman named Renee, who lived in Asheville and had no known connection to Yancey County. Her roommate confirmed she had left for a solo hiking trip 3 days earlier and was expected back 2 days ago. She had not arrived. She had not called. The search that followed lasted 9 days. They covered more than 40 square miles of the Pisgah National Forest terrain surrounding that access road. I was out there myself on days 2 and 3, helping with vehicle transport and grid coordination. They did not find Renee. They found her backpack about 2 miles from the car, up an unmarked trail. Contents undisturbed. Rain jacket, water filter, food supply. They found one of her hiking boots about a half-mile from the backpack, tied neatly to a tree branch about 4 feet off the ground. The engine temperature. That is the part I keep coming back to. 3.5 hours after the hunter found the car, the engine was still warm. Either the timeline was wrong, or someone had been there, someone with a key, or someone who could start the car, in the hours between the hunter's arrival and mine. The hunter swore he hadn't touched the vehicle. I have no reason not to believe him. The deputy didn't have an explanation either. Renee has not been found. The case is still listed as an active missing persons investigation. Her family has set up a find page online that gets updated occasionally with search efforts in the area. I still run tow calls out to FS 278 a few times a year. Every time, I check the engine of any vehicle I'm responding to before I note the time of arrival. It matters more than most people realize. Story 6. People assume that the most frightening part of being an emergency dispatcher is the calls. The ones where someone is in danger and you can hear it happening. And that's true. That is hard. But the call that has stayed with me in the 5 years since it happened wasn't a distress call. It wasn't even a call in the traditional sense. It was a voice that appeared on the radio channel in the middle of the night on a frequency that was supposed to be secure and described in real time exactly what I was seeing on my own dispatch screen. It was a Tuesday in February, around 2 in the morning. Activity was low, a fender bender being worked off Interstate 26, a wellness check on the east side of the county. I was alone in the dispatch center, as I usually was on the overnight. The duty channel had been quiet for almost 20 minutes when a voice broke through. Not a unit calling in, not the familiar cadence of an officer or deputy. A voice, flat, unhurried, slightly too even, that said, "There's a vehicle stopped on Route 70 East, mile marker 34. Driver is out of the vehicle, standing in the road." I looked at my screen. There was no active call or report at that location. I checked the logging feed. Nothing incoming. The radio had picked up what it picked up, and then gone quiet. I assumed it was an unusual civilian transmission, someone with a scanner who'd gotten confused about which frequency they were broadcasting on. I dispatched a county unit to mile marker 34 on Route 70 East anyway, because that's procedure. The deputy reached the location and confirmed. There was a vehicle stopped on the road's edge at mile marker 34. The driver was standing in the road. A 67-year-old man from Cookville who had pulled over because he felt dizzy and was worried about his heart. He was completely fine. Slightly elevated blood pressure, took some time to stabilize before he felt comfortable driving again. He went home. Nothing remarkable. What was remarkable was what happened next on the radio. 20 minutes after the deputy cleared the welfare call, the flat voice came back. It said, "Unit 7 is back on Route 70, heading west. There's something on the road about 2 miles ahead. You should let him know." I looked at my board. Unit 7 was indeed heading west on Route 70, having just cleared the call. I keyed up and contacted Unit 7 immediately. He slowed down. He found a large, white-tailed deer, still alive but badly injured, lying in the travel lane, exactly where the voice had indicated. I spent the next hour trying to trace the radio transmission. Our technical coordinator pulled the logs the next morning. The transmissions had come through on our secondary duty channel, a frequency that required department-issued hardware to access. It was not a public frequency. It was not a frequency a civilian scanner would typically find. Whoever had spoken had done so from equipment that should not have been in civilian possession. We never identified the source. No rogue transmissions on that channel before or since. No department personnel admitted to making the calls, and the log confirmed no authorized unit had keyed that channel at those times. I think about the specificity of it, the mile marker, the direction of travel, the deer. Whoever it was, they could see what was happening on those roads in real time, and they knew enough about our systems to break through in a way that left no traceable origin. That's what I keep coming back to. Not what they said, but how they knew to say it at all. Story 7. Part of my job as a wildlife officer is driving roads that most people don't drive. Logging access routes, Forest Service lanes, old game survey roads that go deep into the ridgeline and terminate at a gate or a dead end. I've been doing this work in the Cherokee National Forest Territory for 8 years, and I can tell you that the condition of a dead-end road tells you a lot about what's been happening near it. Tire tracks don't lie. Neither does fresh gravel disturbance. What I found on Old Wire Road off Route 107 in October told me something was very wrong before I ever saw a single person. I was running a routine road survey, checking for off-road vehicle damage, illegal dumping, that kind of thing. Old Wire Road dead ends about 4 miles off the main route at a locked Forest Service gate. The gate had been locked for 3 years following a land reclassification. I drove it maybe 6 times a year as part of my coverage. I turned onto the road around 7 in the morning and noticed the first sign within a quarter mile. Tire tracks in the shoulder mud, multiple sets, both coming and going. Not unusual for a road like this. People pull in to fish the nearby creek, let their dogs run. But these tracks were heavier than that. Deep impressions suggesting loaded vehicles. Trucks. I slowed down and looked more carefully. There were at least 4 distinct tread patterns, all recent. About a mile in, I found the second thing, a section of road that had been freshly graveled. Not by any work crew I knew of. I would have been notified of any Forest Service maintenance on this road. Someone had brought gravel in and laid it over a muddy section, packing it down enough to support heavy vehicle traffic. This was not a casual visitor. This was someone making a road workable. The third thing was the smell, about 2 miles in. A faint but distinct chemical odor that I recognized from training. Solvent-based. The kind of thing that doesn't belong anywhere near a national forest. I stopped my truck and called it in. My supervisor told me to stay with my vehicle and not approach the gate or beyond. I did as instructed. While I waited for backup, which was going to be an hour minimum given my location, I walked the road edge on foot, staying back from the tree line. Behind a cluster of hemlocks about 30 yards off the road, I found tire ruts leading into the brush. Heavy, sustained use. The vegetation between the ruts was flattened and dead. I followed the ruts with my eyes until they disappeared into the darker timber. I did not follow them in person. Law enforcement arrived in force. 2 sheriff's deputies, a state narcotics officer, and 2 additional wildlife officers. We went in as a group. What we found past that gate, about a mile into the dead timber, was an operation that had been running for what the investigators estimated was at least 8 months. Structures, generators, chemical storage, all of it dismantled and cleared out. Whoever had been operating there had been tipped off or had extremely good timing. The site was cold. Everything movable had been moved. What bothered me most, and still does, was the road maintenance. The gravel, the packed lanes, the care that went into keeping those access routes viable for heavy equipment. That takes planning. That takes resources. That takes someone who expected to be there for a long time and wanted to make sure the road stayed workable in all weather. They packed up and left in a matter of what the investigators estimated was 24 to 48 hours. Someone told them I was coming, or someone very experienced knew when to expect a survey run. I still drive Old Wire Road. The gates are relocked, the gravel section is grown over. But I always slow down at that hemlock stand. I always look at the ruts. They've faded, but they're still there. Story 8. I was 22 when this happened, during my senior year at school in Radford. I'm 27 now, and I've told this story to maybe 4 people. Because every time I tell it, I get to a certain point and realize I genuinely cannot account for the time. And I cannot explain why the landmarks were wrong. And I cannot explain what the man in the orange truck was doing, or why he looked the way he did. So I usually stop telling it about halfway through. I'm going to finish it this time. It was a Saturday in late September, and I was driving from my friend's apartment in Pulaski back to Radford. It's a 15-minute drive on US 11. I had made it probably 40 times. I left at around 9:30 at night, perfectly sober, not tired, not distracted. I had a full tank of gas. I turned onto Route 11 North and drove for about 5 minutes before I noticed that the road had changed. Not suddenly, gradually. The pavement texture shifted. The lane markings became older, more faded. The shoulder was narrower. I checked my GPS, and it still showed me on Route 11, headed north, ETA 12 minutes. Then I passed a road sign I didn't recognize, a green marker for Skag Hollow Road. I had driven Route 11 between those towns dozens of times. There was no Skag Hollow Road on it. I noted it and kept driving. 10 minutes later, I passed it again. Same sign, same lettering, same small reflective anchor stake in the same position. I had not turned around. I had not made a U-turn. I had been driving north, or what the GPS confirmed was north, for 10 consecutive minutes, and I had passed the same road sign twice. I pulled over. My hands were shaking slightly, which I noticed, and found strange because I didn't feel scared yet. I was in the confused stage, where your brain is still trying to find the normal explanation. I checked my GPS again. It showed me 11 miles north of where I had started, which was impossible, because I'd been driving for 15 minutes total, and there was no way I had covered 11 miles on a route that should have covered 8. I put the phone down and looked up. There was a pickup truck parked on the opposite shoulder about 100 yards ahead. Orange, faded, older model. I hadn't seen it before I stopped. It was just there, facing south, engine off, no lights. I watched it for a minute. No movement. I pulled back onto the road and drove north past it. As I passed, I looked through my driver's side window. A man was sitting in the driver's seat, watching me go by. He was holding something in both hands. I couldn't see what from that angle. His face was turned fully toward me the entire time I was passing. I drove fast after that. The next landmark I recognized, a firehouse I passed every time on Route 11, appeared 11 minutes later. I pulled into its parking lot and sat in my car for 10 minutes. My GPS said the total drive time from departure to current location was 47 minutes. I had left at 9:30. It was now 10:17. The drive should have taken 15 minutes. I had driven what felt like 15 minutes and one turn. I could account for roughly 20 minutes of continuous, attentive driving. I cannot account for the other 27. I looked up Skag Hollow Road when I got back to my dorm. I couldn't find a road by that name in Pulaski County. I looked in Montgomery County, Wythe County. Nothing. I drove Route 11 the very next day, in daylight, and found no closed or alternate byway, no old pavement section, nothing out of place. I drove it 3 more times that week, exactly the same road every time. I don't have an explanation. I've thought about carbon monoxide, about a mini seizure, about falling asleep and not realizing it. But I was aware the entire time. I was reading signs. I was checking my GPS. I watched that man in the orange truck track me with his eyes as I drove past. Whatever happened on that road, it happened to me wide awake. And that is the part I can't put down. Story 9. I have been a deputy with a county sheriff's office in southern Appalachia for 6 years. I'm not going to specify the county, and I'm not going to give exact road names. Not because I want to be mysterious, but because this case is still technically open, and because I've been told clearly by my sheriff that I am to say nothing that could compromise the investigation. What I can tell you is what I personally witnessed on a night patrol in November of last year, and what it led to, and what has not yet been explained. We had been getting anonymous calls, 3 of them over 4 weeks, all originating from a disposable phone, all reporting strange activity near an old mining access road in the southern part of the county. The caller never identified themselves. They described lights moving near the old site at night, the sound of equipment running, and, on the 3rd call, a hole in the ground that wasn't there before, near the highway edge. My sergeant assigned me to do a late-night pass on the road following the third call. I was told it was likely a mining company doing unlicensed soil testing, something that happened more than people realized in coal country, and that I should document what I found and call for additional units if I encountered anyone. Routine, or so we thought. I reached the access road just after midnight. The old mining community was about a mile off the main highway. A row of collapsed buildings, a concrete foundation where a processing facility used to stand, and a series of overgrown access lanes that the coal company had cut decades ago. The place had been officially decommissioned and transferred to the county land bank in the early 2000s. No lights when I arrived. No sound of equipment. I parked at the road edge and walked in with my flashlight and body camera running. First thing I noticed, fresh tire tracks in the soft ground at the entrance. Heavy vehicle, wide wheelbase. Recent. The ground was soft from recent rain and the tracks were sharp-edged, meaning they hadn't been there through the night's temperature cycle. They were fresh that evening. I followed the tracks on foot. They led to the concrete foundation of the old processing building, circled it once, then headed south toward the highway edge, a section of overgrown ground between the access road and the main highway right-of-way. The tracks stopped at a point about 40 yards from the highway shoulder. At the end of the tracks, in the beam of my flashlight, was a section of ground that had been disturbed. Not a small disturbance, a rectangular area, roughly 6 feet by 4 feet, where the soil had been turned over and tamped down. Fresh. The earth was darker here, looser than the surrounding ground. I could smell it before I got close. Not decomposition specifically, but turned soil, wet and mineral sharp. I called it in immediately. I told my sergeant exactly what I was looking at, described the dimensions, and said I needed the on-call investigator and a crime scene unit. I backed away from the disturbed area and secured the perimeter as best I could. The investigator arrived 45 minutes later. The crime scene unit was there within the hour. Ground-penetrating radar was brought out the following morning. The disturbed area was excavated under investigation protocol. What they found was not a body. It was a set of records, physical documents, sealed in multiple layers of waterproof wrapping and packed inside a metal case before burial. The records were old. Ledgers, correspondence, handwritten logs from the mining operation. The investigator told me the documents were being reviewed by both county and state authorities, and that I was not to discuss the contents. I haven't been told what was in those records. I don't know who buried them, or when, or who made those 3 calls to report the activity. I don't know what the documents contained that made someone decide, in the middle of the night, with a heavy vehicle and fresh earth, that they needed to be put back in the ground after apparently being retrieved, reviewed, and reburied. Because that's what the evidence suggested. The documents hadn't been buried there for decades. The wrapping was contemporary. The burial was recent. Someone had gone to that old mining site in the dark, dug up something, and then returned it. The case is open. The records are in state custody. The anonymous caller has never contacted the office again. I drive that access road once a week now, on my own time. The disturbed ground has been backfilled and secured. The tire tracks have been rained away. There is nothing there that looks like anything happened. But something happened there. And whoever knows the full shape of it isn't talking, at least not to me.